Above her swirled summer cloud, high and icy still, and yet wispy promises of a bright hot day were dotted in the cirrus clouds. A glorious day for those who would take notice, and Cecilia Frobisher was in such a mind to enjoy her surroundings for a brief moment. How was it that so many of the momentous days in her life had occurred on bright, warm, sunny days? She had arrived on the doorstep of 12, Grimwald Place in the middle of the summer, and her subsequent re-arrival in this new reality had been similar. She and Remus had assessed the charred ground where 26 Dalton Drive in Edgeford had once been under the hot summer sun of an August midday, and had agreed that from the levelled remains of the old house a new one would be suitable for all three of them. And now, today, was another one. She looked down, far down, from the high natural scaffold of the sea mountain island, and wondered whether the weather would hold throughout her journey and continue to enhance her already optimistic, renewed Cecilia. Nearly 12 years had passed since she had been pulled up from behind the veil by Lucius Malfoy, almost 12 years since she had assaulted him, opened her heart to Cleus Lupin, who she had mistaken for her Remus, been introduced to Aberforth Dumbledore, met the reciprocators, adopted Freya, and fallen in love with Remus in this world. 12 years since she had used the idea of a literary purge of her soul suggested to her by Aberforth to put there. Well, not the past, but the other place, behind her. This world was a new start. It was, Cecilia had found, was familiar but with almost deliberate mistakes. She had met several wizards and witches through the reciprocators, but had had to correct her thinking on many occasions where her assumptions had got her into mildly difficult situations. History wasn't quite the same here, not in many significant ways, but different enough for Cecilia to notice the presence or, more embarrassingly, the absence of people, both magical and non-magical. She had taken up Aberforth's offer of teaching science at Hedgewood's and, with Severus Snape, had worked on the scientific aspects of the universal link, something well known by wizards here and which was slowly infiltrating its way into non-wizard social and academic cultures. It had taken time, but now it was common for newspapers and magazines to run articles where the explanation for such a link, between energy and light and magic, was mentioned briefly and assumed, like DNA fingerprinting, to be self-explanatory. So Cecilia, even when she had been her lowest, had counted her blessings. She was living in the equivalent of her old house, the address being the same but the structure and layout, being decided by them both, very different to the one she had shared with Tim Frobisher. That was a small difference, but other, fundamental differences had contributed to more than a few difficulties for Cecilia. Remus, for example. Here, in this place, Remus John Lupin, by lucky chance evaded the werewolf bite, for Fenrir Greyback's unfortunate victim had been his unfortunate brother Coleus, who had received it, however, for the same reason as had happened to Remus in the other world. In the pay of dark wizards, Greyback was searching for mysterious mythology and had become frenetic when Coleus had attempted to prevent it being taken. As such, Remus's personality here was far more extroverted than Cecilia had known. Erudite, clever, confident and forthright were adjectives more associated with Remus Lupin now, not the slightly introverted diffidence which had been Remus Lupin before, recipient of the werewolf's bite. But more than that. On nights when she would lie awake, thinking about the other place, she had struggled to remember her Remus, the version of the man whom she had loved first. There were times when Cecilia had almost forgotten the Remus she had once known, and now, like a misty shadow, that old image was hard to hold on to in her mind. Remus had been happy to adopt Freya, not officially at least, but to them both she was as good as their own. Here Freya had been rescued the night that Cecilia had been taken from the Department of Mysteries in the combined government to 12, Grimwald Place by Sirius Black after a reciprocator call-out where both her ministry employed non-wizard parents Libby and Derek had endured fatal accidents. Freya had taken to Cecilia and Remus, regularly questioning the cause and circumstances of parents' death, something about which Cecilia knew very little, but she seemed contented, in general, to be living with them. Her black kitten, Tipex, was her best friend, and he was often seen following her to her primary school in Edgeford, or to the treehouse in the Lupins' garden where she often hid away with her Enid Blyton books. It had helped, Cecilia thought, that Septimus was born soon afterwards. Freya had bonded with their son immediately and could be no more of a devoted sibling had she been related to them all genetically. A rosy, comfortable, contented life. And then it happened. Not all at once but, as these things often do, by small, imperceptible increments which, on their own, look like nothing more than short-term improvements. A call to increase more wizard-non-wizard integration, more shared facilities, common school teachings. While Freya was still at primary school, wizards and non-wizards were taught about magical history and shown what it was like to be a wizard, and similarly the alternative history for non-wizards. It had been that, Cecilia had thought, looking back over recent history when she had been at her lowest, that which been the start for Freya. She was a non-wizard like her parents, but, like her parents, had a fascination for all things magical. They had volunteered before Cecilia's coming to this world as part of a group of people organized by the ministry to work in non-wizard communities to promote magic. They aimed to make people feel it was something to embrace rather than fear. NWRs they were called, or knew as non-wizard reciprocators. And, on the face of it, there was nothing whatsoever wrong with this. In fact, with the mood of the country, one of openness and tolerance, it was seen as a really good thing to do. Though few in number, the Newers, buoyed by personal enthusiasm, really did help open up sections of non-wizard society to the fact that wizards were just like them, really. The descending path on which Cecilia was treading wove between rugged vertical cliffs. The summer, often absent even in August in this part of the world, brought with it sharp, cold bites of air despite the early morning sunshine, and Cecilia pulled her jacket closer as she concentrated carefully on her step. She had brought nothing with her to this place except for a few personal belongings and her picture of Septimus. Septimus. Here, he was the single most important thing in her life. When little Tim was born, the uneasy feeling of fitting into a new world was crushed, for she had a beautiful baby boy on her hands. His dark hair gave way to bright blonde locks as his first year passed. He had Cecilia's oval-shaped face, and his pale eyes sparkled like gemstones, alive with interest in the world. She took time away from Hedgewoods, returning when Septimus was 4, and Remus took a part-time job with the ministry so as to take care of him. Again, nothing wrong with this save the whisper of agony on her stomach when she was parted from him. The thought was always worse than the actual going. Septimus knew that his mum worked at Hedgewoods and where she was, but deep down Cecilia longed to be with him. The longing of missing her son growing up day by day stung as she looked down at the grass-strewn steps, thin and patchy, hiding treacherous mud. One false step and Cecilia would be a goner. Below her in the harbour a lone ship swayed, its sails being let out in readiness for impending departure. Cecilia hastened her step, chancing her luck. She must be on it before the early dawn mist was driven from around the island. As well as his father and his sister, Septimus was close to his uncle too. Uncle K. Callias was an unspeakable in the Department of Mysteries, a relatively prestigious role considering his lycanthropy. It had been Remus, his younger by 4 years brother, who had gone to Aberforth Dumbledore at Hedgewoods and asked for his brother to be accepted. Remus had been just 12 when he had gone to the school's headmaster, and he had taken with him Severus Snape, whom he had approached beforehand and who had agreed with confidence to manufacture a cure. For that was what else was different here. All the scientific developments over the last 300 years had occurred in both wizard and non-wizard sections of society and had hastened the discovery, refinement and application of magical spells and potions. What was well known in wizard lore, such as the repulsion of werewolves using silver, was borne out by scientific explanation, and using science therefore, potions could be refined and improved. It was for such unparalleled genius that Severus Snape in this world stood tall. He had spent his school years in potions development and had continued with this area of research when he became professor of the subject at just 18. In this world, magical institutions, as non-magical ones, were expected to undertake research, and this was an obvious choice for Severus Snape. His fame was known the world over, but to him he never saw it as anything other than being him. Perhaps he was destined to form a close relationship with Tabitha Penwright, who attended Hedgewoods on paper but spent most of her teenage years in the Department of Mysteries, most specifically behind the Veil, a place she felt more at home in than her own, not least because she was the only person in this new world who could traverse it and the second only to come back. Cecilia Frobisher, now Lupin, could surely be forgiven for drawing comparisons and contrasts between POP she knew in the world prior to her changing the past. Perhaps it was even understandable. A psychiatrist might even have called it necessary. But she had not banked on her adopted daughter's unruly behavior, nor the teenage Freya's emotions. It had been the results of her naive foolishness that, following Aberforth's death, had caused Cecilia to think dreadful things of her only trusted confidant, one of which being, if only he hadn't positively encouraged her to write the story that never was. For she surely would have not poured her heart into further writings, personal journal entries which had helped her live comfortably and which the girl, in her anger at Cecilia, which she had used against her. It had been her research journals which Freya had read out before the reciprocators. More than just a written record of facts and conclusions, they had become, 3 or 4 years before, a vessel, a shoulder. Cecilia had taken out her ire about all of them. A cool breeze whipped around the night-out juttings and she looked towards it, blinking at its iciness before taking a few more steps down towards the water edge. It wouldn't be long before the northern school dissolved from view and into invisibility as she stepped aboard the readied ship. When Freya, who had been masquerading as a student at Hedgewoods, was finally discovered, Cecilia had chided her and she had taken it personally. Perhaps she had not been there for the girl, who had spent a lot of time at 12 Grimwald Place with Remus, as had Septimus. Freya had bonded firmly with Tunks too and looked upon her as an older sister. As such, Cecilia had concluded, she had not taken kindly to the reprimand from her absent, adopted mother. The feeling that Cecilia had spent too long away seemed to be one silently agreed and concluded by the reciprocators that particular summer. Aberforth had died just as the term at Hedgewoods had ended and everything seemed flat and dull and lifeless. Freya must have been planning her revenge for several days, if not weeks, and had chosen Aberforth's funeral wake to read out her Cecilia's journals in their crude, uninhibited, horrifying frankness. It had taken Remus to lead Freya away, not before the girl had narrated a good section of it, looking at each victim with a raised eyebrow and malicious smile, and Cecilia had not only wished she could have fallen through the floor but through the wall into either 10 or 14 Grimwald Place. Her hypothesis on commonality, reciprocator concealed and divisive, had been bad enough. She had been planning to share it, of course, but tactfully and discreetly, not disordered, like her notes had been. But she had argued with Henrietta when the witch had torn into her for her caustic views, causing Cecilia to reply with equal acerbity about her treatment, her demotion and dismissal from Hedgewoods, her exclusion from them socially and increasing isolation by their faction-like manner. If she was honest, Cecilia would have admitted that something had been going wrong 6 months before Aberforth's death. She had been increasingly dreaming about the old world and had been dreading the break that Christmas which would have taken her back to Dalton Drive, her life with Remus, who she sensed had been becoming more distant, and to the increasingly turbulent Freya. Cecilia knew that, deep down, her husband did resent being the one at home with the children and, after having gone to seek counsel from Snape, had voiced aloud her devotion to Septimus, and this had persuaded her to return. That and her pathetic attempt at seduction. All credit she had given to Snape for rebutting her so kindly, for not mentioning it again, and for continuing with their professional life as if nothing had happened. The sands below were grey-green with rocks interspersed with the sediment. Another 30 or so feet and she would be down there, with the sharp igneous outcrops under her feet. She replayed her thoughts both of her darkest day at Grimmauld Place and her memories of writing her pretentious account blending into vision. She had spoken of Harry, and Hermione and Ron too, wondering if the match between the former two was advisable when Ron and Hermione had been so well suited. How different Harry was, but how grateful she was that Septimus was such good friends with Sam, who reminded her more of how the Harry she knew. How the wizards and witches who had been Death Eaters were quirky individuals but whose characters were flawed in such a way that they could be tempted into bigotry just as easily. How she and Remus had been arguing more and more as the years had gone on, and whether they would be any different, or better, had he been the victim of Greyback rather than Chilius, a typical politician who did nothing to dispel the loathsomeness which surrounds those in power. How Sirius was a weak, vain snob of a man who did little for the reciprocators but took all the credit. How Snape in Old World could have been like Snape in this but for the things he had gone through, how James was cute, how Lily was a bit of a bossy madam and Henrietta was devious, manipulative player of people. How, when she felt so awful, after a week of relentless lessons, research tasks and meetings, if only she could go back to the other place, just to see them, to see her Remus. And if that she could get the potion made here and tested by Harry here, then the discrepancy in the Old World could be accounted for and Harry would defeat Voldemort. How her guilt was sometimes all-consuming. She had married for love and had promised to respect, honor and cherish Remus John Lupin and bring up Freya as best as she could. How her hopes for Septimus were that he had a happy life, and that she had done little to help her son so far. How, if only, she had gone with her instinct when she had first arrived and never set foot in Hedgewoods, had kept Septimus close, been a proper mother to him and Freya and had had the confidence to stand up to Chilius, to Severus and, probably, to Aberforth. How that life might have been so much better had she not assumed, in her haste, that the people here were as the Old World, personalities and circumstances aside. She was as much to blame for everything she had thrown around in her journals as they were, for her own short-sightedness and fraught naivety. But the damage had been done. Remus had been embarrassed, that she knew and, after her verbal altercation with Henrietta Edwards she had left by the front door. Chilius had gone after her, had told her she was no longer needed at Hedgewoods and must go to Durmstrang and, after insisting on confirmation of her dispensability from Severus which he had given to her right there outside number 12, Chilius had then added that her job was to spy or she would be taken in by ministry and imprisoned. Her last thoughts as they had departed London there and then by brougham were of Septimus. He was her rock, for who Cecilia lived. She had been glad he hadn't been at Aberforth's wake and, after she had reluctantly taken up her pre-arranged research work, a cover for spying on Durmstrang's staff's research, had also been glad that Chilius offered her a purpose. Cecilia hated that about Chilius, his skill at delivering bad news as if it were anything but was refined to a point of giftedness and she knew that Uncle K adored Septimus. She hadn't been surprised when Septimus had written to tell her that he and Remus had moved into the Lupin cottage with Chilius, how he had begun to attend a primary school in Borrowdale which was small, but okay, which his mother would have approved of because it was full of books and how Freya had gone to live with Tunks and Nick. Letters had kept her going and she had written happily about her day-to-day life at Durmstrang, the tone of which becoming vaguer and more offhand as her mood had grown darker and more morose. Severus Snape had been her other epistle exchanger but, as the months had worn on his letters had become increasingly more infrequent. And then, she had done what she had later considered to be the one single act which had sealed her isolation. She had asked Snape to make Harry's potion. Cecilia's left foot struck a hard obstacle and she realized she had got to the bottom. The here and now burst into her consciousness as she looked around her at the wide-open expanse of ocean, so far north that it was now not the North Sea but the Atlantic. The magical ship which was the only way to leave Durmstrang Institute bobbed ominously before her. It was perhaps inevitable that Snape wouldn't reply. Were the roles have been reversed, it is very likely that Cecilia would have considered herself deluded and crazy. It had been Ragnhild Anderson, with whom she worked on a daily basis, who had met her as Cecilia had made her way towards the ground floor exit and the murderous sheer cliffs which were no more than 10 steps from the thick oak door. It had been another turning point and, as she had gone straight back to her room, swallowed her pride and reasoned that she so little left to lose that her pride thrown back in her face by Sirius Black would be just a drop in the ocean, Ragnhild's words asking her whether a person should care more about being right or being happy. She wanted to be happy. And now she would be. That night, only a few days ago, had brought a frank conversation with Sirius. A tearful and gut-wrenching emotional reunion with Remus and a promise to herself that she would never, ever research anything again, that she would be home with her family and do what she wanted, no matter what the Ministry cared. The flames licking around her journals, ending the curse of her vitriolic opinions, outrageous conjectures and suppositions about commonality and anything she had uncovered in her biennial tour of duty at the Scandinavian Wizard School, cleansed her. She had put the past behind her, both pasts, and closed her mind to the future, refusing to make any assumptions about what may come to pass in her life. Cecilia moved on to the small, wooden, saline bleached wharf. She looked at the sea, to the west, where her family was. Durmstrang above was behind her too. If she looked up now, Cecilia would, as she crossed the edge stones, indefinable amongst the rubble on the shore, see the school become invisible and hidden. Once, she had clung onto it, hoping for her research to be her salvation and blending in with the single-minded, neurotic staff as if she were a witch herself. But she had dared herself to want happiness again, to want her family Remus and her beloved son Septimus. She had reconnected with her husband and they had vowed to make it work. She was renewed. She was going home. It was only when the crewless ship was a few miles out into open water that Cecilia gave in to her urge to look back. Durmstrang, the square, fortress-like building which nestled amongst the crags of Drangen, was no more. The island was now just another mountain, another pinnacle to scale by peak-baggers the world over.